Rishi Sunak's pledge to grant hundreds of new oil and gas licenses and, quote, max out North Sea developments has been condemned by politicians on both sides of the political divide. But the best-known group protesting against the prospect of new oil and gas licenses is, of course, Just Stop Oil. Emma Desaram is an activist from the group, and she appeared on Sky News to condemn the Prime Minister's promise. But Mark Austin decided to ask her this.
Key here is that the UK is responsible for less than 1% of global emissions.
Because we export a lot of our emissions. Look, there are hundreds, thousands of authorities who are saying no new oil and gas, okay? The people and the institutions who agree that no new oil and gas is incompatible with a safer climate, the International Energy Agency, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations Secretary, the British Medical Association, Oxfam, the Quake, I could go on. There are loads.
I've got your list. I've got your list. But why not? I mean, why not protest in China or protest outside the Chinese embassy about fossil fuels? Their coal production is going up. 3.2 billion tonnes in 2022, more in 2023, predicted to be 3.9 billion tonnes. So if you want to go and protest about fossil fuels, protest against the Chinese.
But I'm not in China. I'm a resident in this country, and that's why I'm protesting about our government not doing enough. We are one of the most responsible historically, the most responsible for the climate crisis, and that is why I'm using my rights, as much as they're being eroded away right now, using my rights in this country to protest against this government, against new fossil fuels.
Why aren't you protesting China? It's the classic diversion tactic that the press use when it comes to holding our own government accountable for their policies, particularly around climate breakdown. And listen, Emma came prepared. That was an incredibly patient and well-informed response to a very, I would say, bad faith question. And she was completely right. Of course, it makes sense to leverage political power where you are in the context that you know. But also the thing that she said about the historic emissions is completely correct. And it's really relevant to the question that was being asked of her. So let's look at some of the data around this debate, because it is true, yes, that China currently emits more CO2 than the UK. This chart from Our World in Data shows that this wasn't always the case. Per capita, China's CO2 emissions only eclipsed the United Kingdom's this millennium. And you can see how much more we pumped out starting as far back as the 18th century. It's not hard to see that we, as well as other developed nations, might have a special responsibility to cut back our emissions first. What's more, just because Britain isn't directly emitting as much fossil fuels as China doesn't mean that we aren't facilitating the industry in other ways. The City of London, for example, is an integral part of global fossil fuel infrastructure. And according to Reclaim Finance, it's the biggest centre for coal finance in Europe. So reining in the ability of the city to fund and ensure fossil fuel projects is integral to a just transition. But it's also as if Sunak doesn't want to talk about the environmental and economic benefits of increasing investment in the green economy. And maybe there is a reason for that. Byline Times' Adam Bienkov posted this on social media. Rishi Sunak's family business Infosys boasts of its partnership with 2 of the top 5 integrated oil and gas companies, 3 of the top 4 oil field service providers, and 5 of the top 10 upstream enterprises across the oil and gas landscape. Now, we should be careful here. Infosys is the Indian firm started by the father of Sunak's wife, Akshata Murthy. Rishi Sunak has no direct involvement in it. But Infosys is worth $70 billion, and Murthy's shares brought her £6.7 million in dividends in April. Bienkov went on to say this. One of Infosys' major clients is Shell, whose CEO joined Rishi Sunak's new business council 2 weeks ago and promised a candid collaboration with his government. Sunak's family firm Infosys also signed a deal reported to be worth $1.5 billion with BP just 2 months ago. Now, as I said, Rishi Sunak has no direct involvement in Infosys, but it's hard to see how he and his children aren't beneficiaries of these business deals. And yet Infosys appears nowhere in his register of interests.
In recent weeks and recent days, we've seen that Rishi Sunak is not the leader that's going to lead this nation to net zero. If anything, quite the opposite. I'd argue that a Conservative government and a Rishi Sunak-led Conservative government diametrically opposed to the idea of getting to net zero. I mean, we've seen him kind of take the side of drivers against the anti-drive wokerati, apparently, all of that jazz, the classic Conservative culture war stuff. And the announcement yesterday about new oil and gas in the North Sea. So, Rishi Sunak is not a serious politician when it comes to the climate crisis. And I actually think he's been wildly incompetent here, because this is not going to win over any voters. Voters, as I mentioned earlier, see, oil and gas companies as the bad guys. In many ways, a lot of voters are very driven when it comes to the climate crisis and want that to be addressed by a government. So the idea that, Rishi Sunak can water down climate pledges, can water down his commitment to net zero, and still think he can appeal to voters is absolutely bonkers, to kind of put it mildly. It's ridiculous. And I just think that, Sunak was framed by some as, the man's going to steady the ship and he's going to win over some voters back to the Conservative Party. He's doing anything but that. And I think it just shows that he's not that savvy a politician. He wears a nice suit and speaks a good game sometimes, but when you kind of look beneath the surface, there isn't much substance there, and he's not really appealing to any distinct group of voters. Maybe like a small niche group of voters, but it's not going to win him an election with strategy. So it's just bonkers and silly.
Yeah, and I think also what is really interesting about this is the way that we talk about something like government interest and conflict of interest. So normally, in order for something to be registered as a conflict of interest, there has to be a direct connection between a company that's profiting from government policy and the politician who is implementing that policy. But that doesn't capture the way that interest as a broader structural, concept is constituted. When you have a government that is creating a particular political environment that enriches a particular set of actors that either are connected to people around him, whether it's people that he's directly related to, his wife, husband, friends, whatever, or are a community of people that that person is looking to become part of when they leave office, that is also a conflict of interest. It's a conflict of interest in the kind of structural conditions that are about enriching very wealthy people, of which these politicians see themselves as part of that community of rich people who are going to be made wealthier by the conditions, whether it's austerity, whether it's lack of regulation around oil and gas. And so the frameworks that we have for flagging whether or not something is a conflict of interest really don't capture actually the bigger issue of in whose interest our governments govern and what they see their role as being, whether they see themselves more as part of us or as part of, those shareholders that make all this money from policies that are going to kill us, essentially.